me now the former Deputy Communications Director for Vice President Harris, Rachel Palermo, and former Trump administration official Matt Mowers. Rachel, I just want to start with you because add McMaster to this list of people who say they won't either work for Trump, haven't endorsed him, are endorsing Harris. I mean, it's a long list. You got former Defense Secretary Esper, you got former Defense Secretary Mattis, you got former Chief of Staff Kelly, you've got Anthony Scaramucci, Stephanie Grisham, who spoke at the Democratic Convention, Alyssa Vera Griffin, who was against Donald Trump. I don't think Mike Pence hasn't come out in support of Donald Trump yet. So, Rachel, what does this tell you about Trump?
This is incredibly concerning. I worry almost at this point that people are desensitized to the number of former Trump aides who are coming out and saying that they don't endorse him for president or that they're revealing new details that are really concerning. For example, General McMaster talked about how Donald Trump wanted to surround himself with people who only uplifted his opinions and didn't give him unvarnished assessments. He also said he had to remind Donald Trump that he's not friends with Vladimir Putin. These are all things that are really concerning, and it builds on the fact that a historic number of Republicans are endorsing Vice President Harris for president. There were 6 Republican speakers on the stage of the Democratic National Convention last week, even more in videos. And what's really powerful here is that a lot of them are coming around to saying that what is on the line here is democracy, and they don't believe that if Donald Trump wins, that won't be a concern. And if you think about the statement from Donald Trump's former White House press secretary, what she said is that she saw the lengths that Donald Trump was going to stay in power, and she saw the lies that he told the American people the entire time that he was in office. Hearing those kinds of comments from Trump's closest aides is extremely concerning.
I just want to be clear. General McMaster also said he would not work in a Harris administration. But that aside, Matt, the list of officials, the former Trump officials who are either against him, not for him, or not endorsing him, I mean, why do you think it's so long?
Well, you've got to go back to 2016 in a lot of ways when you had a lot of these same folks, including, by the way, some who ended up going into the administration who didn't really support him then either. I remember there was a big national security letter. It was hyped up by the media. It was hyped up by, at the time, the Clinton campaign saying, look at all these foreign policy experts who oppose Donald Trump. Well, Donald Trump ended up winning because the American people said, those are the people who got us into these problems in the first place. And so, I'm not saying that's the scenario for every single one of the former officials or something like that. But for a lot of them, and politically speaking, the American people say, these are the people who are in the bubble in D.C. These are the people who are used to the status quo and the way things work and the traditional procedures and everything else. Trump obviously was not elected to accommodate that style. He was elected to essentially be, a big middle finger to the system in a lot of ways in Washington, D.C. And that's what a lot of voters are looking for from him. And so when, folks come out, whether they are, work for him or not, a lot of them just see it as kind of part of this D.C. bubble and D.C. blob, that they say, great, if they don't support him, no problem, we'll find some other people to take those jobs.
You say a lot of people. What do you see when you see all these people who worked very closely with Donald Trump, some of whom supported him, not coming? I mean, Mike Pence, who will not supported him now?
And look, Mike Pence obviously has detailed out his reasons for not doing so. And done so in great elaborate length. But for some of them, I'll tell you, and I served in the State Department, so especially in the area of foreign policy and national security, you did see a difference of opinion from Donald Trump versus the traditional Republican orthodoxies of national security and foreign policy. You had a lot of folks who had come in and out of the Bush administration. Back then, it was all about how do we nation build and foreign intervention and some democracy promotion, things like that. Donald Trump changed the playbook on national security and foreign policy issues for Republicans. There was always this consternation between some of the more hawkish conservative figures in the administration and Donald Trump's more, realpolitik instincts, so to speak. And so you're seeing some of that play out. And look, when someone first gets elected as an outsider, you don't really know how they're going to govern. I think a lot of folks went into the administration thinking, well, maybe this will actually be closer to a traditional neoconservative foreign policy thinking, when realistically, Donald Trump wanted to govern the way he campaigned on.
Rachel, I want to talk about the debates, which are now scheduled. A debate is scheduled to happen 2 weeks from now. Not sure it will. I'll leave the debate about the debates aside and talk instead with you about what you think Vice President Harris needs out of a debate against Donald Trump?
I think that for the debate, it's going to be another platform, just like the Democratic National Convention was last week, to really share her story and to share her vision. And what's a great opportunity about the debate is that she will be on a stage standing next to Donald Trump, and she will really be able to paint the contrast. Of course, she's a career prosecutor and he's a convicted felon, but they also have vastly different images for how they want to govern this country. The vice president wants to move us forward and not back. She's fighting for the middle class, and Donald Trump is in it for himself and his billionaire friends. And I think when they're on this stage, she will really be able to show the leader that she is and the vision that she has, and that people who are already excited about her can feel more galvanized about helping her win in November. And then people on the fence will also be motivated to support her on the ticket.
Matt, what does Donald Trump want or not want of a debate or a non-debate?
Sure. Well, a couple things. One, he has wanted more debates. It's really a shame Vice President Harris didn't accept the 3 debates that Donald Trump offered to do. I mean, fortunately, hopefully, we at least get 2. Those are going to be important moments because up to this point, Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, has not had to engage with anyone who disagrees with their viewpoint, has not engaged in a setting that does not have a teleprompter. And so the American people, yes, there is some interest in her right now. She can't close that sale, though, unless she starts trying to really detail out who she is as a person, what is her actual vision for the country, and actually answer questions about why does she no longer support ripping away good quality private health insurance for Americans when her campaign now says she doesn't. Why did she flip-flop on fracking ban? Was it just to win Pennsylvania voters, or is that truly what she believes? Why is she changing her opinion about whether it's illegal to be in the country? Is it because border security is one of the #1 issues ranked by Americans? They don't trust the job she did when she was supposed to oversee the border, and yes, also root causes of migration, which she was unable to handle? Or is this just political opportunism? Those are the things and opportunities Donald Trump has to question her on those things. There are questions she has not had to answer at this point because she's had a light campaign schedule that has not had to engage with reporters or adversaries or voters, to be honest. And that's the opportunity that presents itself on September 10th.
Well, we will see if it happens. Matt Mowers, Rachel Palermo, thanks both so much. Great to see you this morning. Sarah?
All right, thank you,
Thanks so much.
John.